Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor, the award-winning Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHW WPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Councilmember Mark Squilla to discuss the impending city budget, which will be passed tomorrow, the proposed 76ers arena, and his interest in the city council presidency. We'll also be joined by Margaret Sanford and Chris Bendel, who will discuss with us what they believe are needed changes at the Mutter Museum. So what we're going to do tonight is get started with our interview with Councilmember Mark Squilla. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Larry and Denise. Appreciate it.
So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about, we're almost through with the budget. What do you think about this budget? What do you think the strengths are in some of the good investments?
Listen, obviously we would like, to have other parts and resources in the budget that we were trying to negotiate. But as a whole, I really believe this can move the city forward. There's been a lot of added budgetary items to include community groups and organizations. There's been a lot of money put into prevention programs, and also a focus on how we deal with our public safety issues. So, this to me is setting the city up to really address the needs of the communities and making sure that we as a city push forward our main priorities. As far as schooling, as far as pre-K, as far as our parks and recreation, and the services necessary to really lead us into the next year.
And how does this process work a little bit? Because you're the whip in city council. You help shepherd the legislation along. What is your role as whip in the budget process?
Well, the budget process, it normally plays out during the hearing process. The administration puts forth a budget. We get to ask questions from each department on their spending and how the budget is going to work. And then what happens is then council members get involved to work with the council president to put in a request that are really important to those council members. So if we want to add more money for mural arts, say for more money for ACCT, animal control, these things then get flushed through the council members to the council president, that then goes and negotiates with the administration on which one of those requests get added into the budget and amended into the budget for the final passage. So as you can imagine, there's 17 different council members that have 17 different numbers of requests. And so the council president's job and the job of the leadership is to try to consolidate those measures and try to get, the best bang for the buck, because it's really, you don't have enough resources to fund every request by each council member. And so, after the council president gets a list of them, he negotiates with the administration. They squash the numbers and come up with what would work best. And then at the end of the day, they present it back to the full council for a vote. So not everybody gets everything they wanted, but as long as we get some of it, and sometimes we get nothing, right? So then we work with the administration and council president leadership to, maybe work in the fall for what we call a transfer ordinance to see if there's additional dollars for programs that did not get funded or departments that didn't get the full allotment that we thought was necessary to enhance the quality of the city moving forward.
So one of the common misconceptions about city council, with only one session left, is that they go on summer break. And then, we know that that's not true because we talked to you in the summer and other council members. Well, what is a summer like for a city council member?
I mean, summer's very busy, especially in my district as a district council person. We still have many events throughout the district. We still have community meetings that we go to throughout the summer. And we meet with, constituents and people who have concerns in our offices. So our offices are still open. 5 days a week. And we're here, from 8 o'clock until 5. So it's just as busy. The only thing we don't do is legislation, but, we do have hearings over the summer. As you heard, we're going to have a public safety summit that's going to be generated this summer to really understand not only what the problems are, because everybody knows what the problems and concerns are, but what are we putting in place to address those problems, and how are we fixing them to actually move the numbers so that public safety, in the next several years will really see a positive change. So, even though there's no council per se, it's not like everybody has their shovels and buckets and they run down the shore to build sandcastles. We're still here, and we still, are accountable to our districts and the people we represent. So it's, the summers are just as busy, and if not busier, with a lot of summer events that we go to, especially over the weekends. But it's a good time to get out and really meet and greet your constituent base.
I'd like to bring in Denise Murray here on Philadelphia Homeowner.
Yes, and thank you, Larry, and thank you for joining us today, Councilmember Squilla.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for having me again.
Well, I guess my first question for you is, one of the things that council is going to be probably taking on is the issue of SEPTA, and the fact that because of the large hole we have in I-95 right now, we need to step up our transportation game. Now, you didn't have necessarily a transportation issue in terms of mass transit in your district, but you had the Washington Avenue road restructuring that you had to deal with. How has that worked out for your constituents? And because we were hearing that there were some problems in terms of the Italian market and how trucks were able to go in and out and deliver goods and services.
Yes, I mean, obviously we made the change. There is a part of the legislation in the change is to do a study 1 year out and 2 years out to understand the impacts on the surrounding communities. And not only a study on Washington Avenue, how it impacts, say, 9th and Washington, where the Italian market is delivering, but also the ancillary streets. So the streets, maybe a Federal Street at Carpenter and Christian, to see, are we impacting those streets also, to really determine if the new design of the street is working the way it was intended. We have made several changes initially from the first design, and the way it was set up was to allow for additional deliveries and freight to be able to move on Washington Avenue, because it is still a commercial corridor, especially with 9th Street being one of the busiest commercial corridors. So those adjustments, not only with loading and unloading, but also light timing, has really seemed to help mitigate those concerns. But it's still a work in progress. There's still challenges with it. Hopefully once we receive the results of these studies, we could even see what the impacts are, and understanding more what changes would need to be made to make it a better operational and safe for both the pedestrians, the bicyclists, the drivers, and the trucks who are delivering for the businesses. So, it's a complicated roadway, and we got to make sure that each stakeholder, their concerns are addressed as we look at what the changes have done. Did it make it safer in one way, but maybe not as safe in another? Did it make it easier to deliver and load the packages in one way and not in another? So we're looking forward to seeing the results of those studies, and then we'll adjust and tweak as we see fit.
Now, I'm sure that one of the things you're going to have to deal with this summer, because there's already been a lot of discussion about it, is the possibility of 76th Place being built off of Market Street. You have very vocal people on all sides. Some think that, if you put it there, it's basically you're destroying Chinatown. And then you have the people who are like, let's build it. I'm tired of people not building things. Let's build it. You have said publicly that unless your constituents tell you that this is what they want, you're not introducing the legislation. What what are you hearing from your constituents now? And are there any meetings planned this summer to discuss this?
Well, the first thing we heard from our constituent base was that they wanted more information. Even the people opposed to it in Chinatown had said that they thought some more studies should be done, economic impact studies, environmental and health impact studies, design studies, parking, traffic studies. So we put an RFP out to do those studies. The RFPs have been returned and studies, people have been selected to do these studies. So we're still going to follow that process to see how these studies come back, to see what the impacts are. There are people opposed to it. There are people very supportive of it. People want me to go to rallies supporting it, then rallies and opposing it. And at this point, I think it would be disingenuous, because until those studies are actually out, and we wouldn't be doing these studies if we were going to take one direction or the other. I think the city will then plan, once the studies are complete, Planning Commission will go out to the communities, review these studies, go over the results of these studies, and then decide at that point how to move forward.
Okay. Now, personally, I believe that based on the Mother's Day game, 7 with the Celtics alone, that, no, until you get a better team on the floor, no. But that's just me. My
We got to
last
get past the second round. We have to get at least past the second round.
hello. And my last question for you is that, as you know, Darrell Clark is retiring, so he's not going to be council president anymore. But that means somebody else is going to be the new council president. And, folks are probably trying to figure out whether or not they're going to run. We're hearing that you might be one of the people that is looking to do that job.
I am
Interested in it? And
I'm very interested. Yes, I'm very interested. I think that the excitement of a new administration and new council leadership coming into the new year is something that really brings a lot of opportunity. And I would love to be part of that leadership and to make that happen. I do believe that I could work with all parties on council. We have a very diverse council, people from different areas of the city, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and also different ideologies. And I think I would be able to work with all those folks in order to build a compromised approach, working with the new administration to really set forth a great agenda in the next upcoming years. So I see this as an opportunity, and I threw my hat into the ring and looking for support. But saying that, I think, whoever is next to lead council will work well with the new administration, and understanding that we as council always have to come together and get 9 votes to support any legislation that we want passed. So we will be able to take that step moving forward. But I would love to be the one to lead us, especially in this historic time where we have our first female mayor, right? First woman ever to lead the city of Philadelphia, which to me is a mark of history. And then, we also have the first open LGBT person on council. So to me, this is exciting times, and it gives us great opportunity with 2026 coming in Philadelphia. We have the World Cup here coming from people from all over the world. We have our 250th anniversary of our country, where it was started right here in Philadelphia. So we have a great opportunity to make that sort of our platform so that we could be our launch pad. So in 2026, we could build up to there, but that shouldn't be our peak. That should be a place where now we start to launch our success as a city, and really the people who come visit it go back and tell others how great it was and what a great opportunity to come to see Philadelphia, and really grow our tax base so that we could help with services that are needed for our residents here in the city of Philadelphia.
okay, thank you for joining us. And I'll be giving you back to my co-host Larry McGlynn, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
Thank you. All right, we'd like to thank Councilmember Mark Squilla for being with us here on Hall Monitor. And Denise, how are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Now, Denise, next week you will be doing the show remotely. Where are you going to be?
Wow, where am I going to be? Um,
I'll give you a
oh
hint.
yeah, I forgot. I'm going to be in Brooklyn because Hall Monitor has won an award, and I'm going to Brooklyn to represent all of us.
Hall Monitor has won the Hometown Media Award, the Democracy in Action Award.
Wow.
Listen to that. That sounds very impressive.
Yes, it does. And you know, we couldn't have done it without those of you who have listened to us and watched us since we've been doing the show, telling us what you need to know about what's going on in City Hall and City Council. And I'm really excited to, you know, go and get this award and also to interact with some of the hometown media folks to see what's going on there, what works, and how we can use it here.
And we get a plaque, I've been told.
Nice.
You'll be getting a plaque and bringing it home to Philadelphia.
The question is, where are we going to put it?
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't know what we're going to do about that. So we want to thank the Hometown Media Awards Association for, I don't know how we got nominated for this, but somehow we did. So whoever nominated us, we'd like to thank them. And we'd like to thank them for honoring us with this award.
Yes,
so now
we're
going to say we're the award-winning Hall Monitor every time.
That's who we are.
Yeah,
and I also wanted to share a piece of information with the audience. Frequent contributor to Hall Monitor, Vanessa Graber, was just reelected president of the Philadelphia chapter of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. So I wanted to make sure to give her a shout out because, you know, she's a big part of what we do. And I wanted folks to know that. Yeah,
and that's well deserved. She works very hard for us and for all the organizations she works with. So we're very happy to see that. And she's been a great leader for that organization. So we want to thank Councilmember Mark Squilla for being with us. A lot of interesting things in the interview that we'll talk about, I think, after we do this next interview. So in continuing with our coverage of the impending possible changes at the Mutter Museum, we were joined by Margaret Sanford and Chris Bendel, who will explain to us why they believe changes at the Mutter Museum need to occur. So here's that interview. All right. We are continuing our discussion about what is happening at the Mutter Museum. We did not expect this to sort of blow up the way it did, but this is a good thing, right? Let's have the discussion. Let's talk more about it. So we are here today with Margaret Sanford. Margaret, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Oh, thank you. Tell us a little bit about your background and what sort of brought you to this discussion.
Yeah, well, I am a trained anthropologist and public historian. I just graduated with my master's from Temple University back in 2022. And I did my public history thesis on the opposition to anatomical dissection and exhibition in Philadelphia history. Additionally, I worked at the Mutter for about a year in visitor services. So I have experience with the collection and some of the people there. And most importantly, I have experience with how the public engages with the Mutter.
Okay. And Chris Bendel, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. I have also recently graduated with my dual master's in history and library science with a focus in archives and special collections from Queens College here in New York City. And my research was on cemeteries as community archives. So familiarity with spaces of the dead and how they interact and how the living interact with them was sort of my focus. And I've presented at the Society of American Archivists conferences, written a couple of papers. And so I felt like it was important to come on and talk about this subject.
Great. So let's do that. Margaret, let me start with you. Let's talk the issue as it is right now. Well, why don't you explain it and then give me your take on it? How does that sound?
Sounds good. So really what's happening is the Mutter is taking some initiatives under the College of Physicians guidance, which is sort of like their governing body. The Mutter is part of the College of Physicians, which is a network of physicians and scholars related to the medical field. And the Mutter is taking steps, what they call the Museum Assessment Program, which is under American Alliance of Museums, to essentially review their collection. And part of that involves temporarily removing some videos, online exhibits, things of that nature, those that feature human remains, to review those for ethical concerns as they move forward with accreditation processes, but also essentially just an ethical review of the collection. There's been quite a bit of backlash to these temporary actions of removing some of these items that speak to an entitlement to the dead. That kind of is the undercurrent of the Mutters collection and of people's engagement with it. I'm of the mindset where reviews need to happen in these types of collections. The care in which these remains have been taken care of needs to be examined, audited, but I really believe that descendant community perspectives should be at the heart of it, and really center the ancestors primarily, and we shouldn't be prioritizing public or fan perspectives about the museum. Community conversation should happen, but not at the expense of repatriation and recovery and naming the injustices that brought these ancestors into this collection.
Chris, give me your take on it.
Well, I think Margaret said fantastically. She has a lot of experience in this area in Philadelphia and with the Mutter. And my sort of initiation into this was seeing the Protect the Mutter petition online, and I don't sign anything without reading it. That's just me. And it seems like the way this spread was a lot of people thought, oh no, a museum's going away. We need to do something about it. So I read the petition and I read some of the initial posts from the online account, and it just sort of felt off to me. It didn't feel like it was centering the descendant communities. It didn't feel like it was concerning themselves with the repatriation and respect of the collections that needs to be there. It felt more like people were upset that they were going to lose access to dead bodies, which that just raises some concerns for me. So I tried to stay out of it and just observe, but then eventually I jumped online and felt like I needed to say something that, no, the responsibility is to the communities and the deceased, not to fans of the museum.
Okay. So I guess one of my big questions about this is when we look at and I don't like even saying exhibits. We're talking about the people. The people who are part of this exhibit. Do we lose a lot in terms of history, medical knowledge, anything that we can look at in the 21st century and say we're learning from these things? Are we losing things by saying, okay, we're taking these parts out of the collection?
I personally don't think so. I think that the harm has been done. I think that primarily these remains, they're not being utilized to that extent. There's very little interpretation in the Mutter as is. Sure, there are signage and there's conversations that might happen during a guided tour, but primarily they're there on display without the context of their existence there. I think the Mutter is in a very unique situation where they have very intentional and excited donations, namely Carol Orzel, who was donated while I was actually there. She had passed away and donated her skeleton to the museum. And that was a powerful example of where consent is really important. But the fact remains, and it's a fact that, hundreds, if not thousands, we don't know the extent of remains in that museum were collected by ill means through very violent circumstances. I think that when we look at what's being lost by them not being on display, we're centering a certain audience, and we should be considering how other people might feel uncomfortable by those remains being there. And we should consider the wishes of descendant communities to have those remains brought back to them and, disposed of how they intend. Chris, do you have anything to add?
Not really. That was great. Let me see. So the things that are being lost when something is introduced into a collection, into an archive, into a museum, anywhere, there are power dynamics at play. There is a transaction, there's purchasing, there's money changing hands. And in this case, it was money changing hands for bodies. And that phrase alone just does not sit well with me. And that idea does not sit well with me. So when thinking about the museum in that sort of context and the people who are on display there, you're watching a transaction that happened, and you're watching a transaction through illegal means, or at least unethical means. And there's, you know, as Hannah mentioned, changing laws about consent, and there's changing norms in society. But I don't think that that's the case in this situation. If you think about yourself or your family members, if you found out that they were grave robbed or dispossessed, or if it was somehow known to you that your own body was taken out of a grave against your own wishes, how would that make you feel? And I don't think that 150 years ago, when the museum started, people's morals and ethics were that different than our own today. There's different evidence, there's different writings saying, well, they thought that this was okay and that was okay. But when you consider your own personal feelings on the matter, and I don't want to be ahistorical and anachronistic, but the claims that education, or the keeping these bodies for the purpose of education, outweighs the ethical concerns, I don't agree with that.
Can I add to that briefly? Because Chris, you brought up such a good point that the ethics of the past, you know, are really not that much different than they are today. And that's one of the biggest findings I found in my thesis, was that there has been documented resistance to this theft and body looting since as early as Philadelphia has been around. Philadelphia is actually home to one of the first, if not the earliest, public demonstration against anatomical dissection and display, when 1796, Dr. Shippen was, you know, dissecting humans that he got out of the Washington Park graveyard here in Philadelphia, and he was dissecting them in his home for an audience. And he was actually run out of his home by a crowd. And in 1845, we see a letter signed by board members, Philadelphia citizens, doctors at the Philadelphia Almshouse, who raise issues to the guardians of the poor, basically saying bodies are missing from our graveyards. They're missing from the almshouse burial grounds, and they're being, you know, disposed of in these private collections, both in doctors' hands and museums' hands. And they actually established protocols that would become the Pennsylvania Anatomy Act of 1883, that, you know, was designed to have unclaimed bodies sent to teaching colleges so we could educate surgeons, but also protected bodies in cemeteries that were really rife for the choosing for both physicians and, you know, the network of body looters that they had supplying these schools and institutions with remains that end up in places like the Mutter or the Penn Museum. 1882, just another brief example. Lebanon Cemetery was a Black cemetery in South Philadelphia, and it was looted. And families were outraged, as Chris said, as we all would be if we learned it was our family members at those hands of the physicians and the body looters. And they, you know, went to City Hall, they went to the morgue. These things end up culminating into legislation like NAGPRA, right, and the African Burial Ground, where like there's demonstrated precedents for action against these remains that have been taken and dispossessed somehow, including today the work of Finding Ceremony by Abdul Ali Muhammad and Dr. Lyra Montero. Actually, I think Abdul Ali said it best, which stolenness is harm that happens in perpetuity. And I think it speaks to Chris's point too about what's lost when you know, these remains are on display. There's already loss being perpetuated in the display.
And to add to that, just from a New York perspective, 1788, we had the doctors' riot, the doctors' mob. So in a similar situation, children found that a woman's body had been removed from its burial site. They told their parents, and a mob formed and stormed the local physician's office. In 1789, New York passed a law that would hopefully prevent future riots by, it was called, I think, I'm gonna have my note here, it's a long one, an act to prevent the odious practice of digging up and removing, for the purposes of dissection, dead bodies interred in cemeteries or burial spaces. It's a long one, but it says exactly what the whole act, you know, legislates. So that was in 1789. And then in 1854, there was an act to promote medical science and protect burial grounds. And this was all about the use of bodies of criminals or murderers who had been executed to provide medical colleges with cadavers for their learning. I'm not saying that these laws are perfect or that they were by any means good, because it is still taking the bodies of deceased individuals who had family and loved ones and mandating them for the purposes of other people's education, and they weren't freely given. And so again, back to what Margaret said about consent, it's a big factor here, and there are just so many bodies at the Mutter that did not give their consent.
Yep.
And Margaret, let me, you would work there. Do we know what percentage of, and again, the collection, I feel odd calling it that, but what percentage of the collection would be repatriated if what you're talking about were to come to fruition?
Oh, so that's tough to say, because frankly, aside from those that, are coming from federally recognized indigenous tribes, that are protected under NAGPRA, there's really no transparent and concise idea of what exactly we're dealing with, which I think is partially the reason for any internal review. And at the very least, it should be grounds for an audit, like an external audit, because I think it's hard to even say. There's so much, and like any museum, I think those of us that have been in them, they're storehouses in an extent. And there's been different levels and layers of different ways of categorizing things. And so it's an intense puzzle to wade through. I could never wager or take a guess at even what extent we're looking at. Besides,
and to that, if I can add, I would think that consent, and the phrase used lately, enthusiastic consent, should be the focus here.
That mean?
Because, I'm sorry?
What does enthusiastic consent mean?
There's no hesitation, there's no reservations about donating your body. It's, yes, you can do whatever you want with it. You can put it on display, you can use it for dissection, you can use it for learning and educational purposes, and not any sort of reservation or this question of power of, okay, well, I consented to medical dissection, but I didn't consent to display, and then you find out later it's on display. So there could be partial or varying levels of consent to what you would like done, and that's perfectly fine. But the absence of consent does not equal consent.
Yes.
So when going through this collection, I think that they're going to find that there is a lot of absence of consent. And in my opinion, that should be the determining factor of, well, what do we do? How do we treat these respectfully? And like Margaret said, Finding Ceremony has some proposals for that.
Okay, I'd like to bring it in this play. Murray here, and pull up your line. And I think you're muted there, Denise.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much for joining us. I feel like I learned a lot in just the last few minutes. I guess my first question, and I don't know how familiar either of you are with the internal workings of the Mutter itself, but what was happening with the Penn Museum and the move remains, what part did that play in the Mutter's decision to maybe revisit some of its policies toward remains?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure, only that the same violence that resulted in the move bombing and the abuse of the remains at the Penn Museum, it's from the same root as why there are remains in the Mutter. I know that Kate Quinn, who's the director, I believe, of the Mutter Museum, she was formerly with the Penn Museum, overseeing exhibits there. I'm not aware of any extent that she had with NAGPRA with remains there, besides engagement with a potential traveling exhibit with the Morton crania. But as far as the move remains, I can't speak to that, only that I think maybe exhibits with human remains are under some more public scrutiny, as they rightly should be. But it's a terrible thing that all these remains are in these similar situations.
Now, the folks, because we had someone on who was taking the opposite view of all of this last week.
Mhm.
And it wasn't so much about the remains, at least from what I got from it, as it was videos and other projects that were making the museum a little more accessible, or at least gave the perception of accessibility.
Mhm.
If you I mean, do you think that's important? And I guess how do you explain to the folks that are like, well, hey, what about accessibility? Why that accessibility may not be a good thing?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think first off, the Mooter is absolutely 100% correct in removing these videos and these images according to both International Council of Museums and American Alliance of Museum Standards. I think if there's any question of if these should be seen by the public at all, they should be taken off for review. As far as accessibility, I think that the Mooter itself does struggle with a bit of accessibility with like the layout of the museum, even physically. And I totally believe in expanding opportunities for people both near and far to engage with collections. But again, I think like Chris and I have been saying, if the collection is human remains that have been taken out of battlegrounds and cemeteries and tended graves and, settler colonial massacre sites, I don't know if that needs to be accessible to more people. I think remains, even the ones that have been donated freely and enthusiastically, like we've been saying, those can be incredibly rich areas for engagement, but it probably should be under a very moderated and sensitive space, something that is a little bit more controlled than a video that can be shared without context. What do you think, Chris?
No, absolutely. I think that accessibility to unethical collections is not not the issue. It's the issue of unethical collections. So while museums are doing a great deal to make the collections more accessible through online content, through social media, through a variety of ways, and it ticked up a lot in the pandemic when people could not physically go to these spaces. Accessing these colonial places is not what needs to happen, I think. And so in this instance, I do agree with the museum itself of this review of saying, okay, well, what is it that we have? Is it perpetuating colonialist and ableist and racist narratives? And if so, we need to take it down and reconsider it, and then figure out how we can make other and better information more accessible. And that comes from centering individuals from these communities. Mm-hmm. If they want to normalize disabled bodies, if they want to normalize or humanize their collections, then they need to use the living communities today at the front and center of this whole process, and not just self-aggrandize their own needs and their own egos.
When Larry and I were talking about this prior to you all coming on, we were, after the last interview we did, we were talking about, the fact that some of the remains from some of these people are, families may not be around to, to rebury them or to put them, in a more sacred spot. And also even the enthusiastic people who, give their remains enthusiastically, I can't help but think that should be revisited every 5 years or something, just to make sure that is something the family still wants to do. Why is it, we're having the discussion now, but why did it take us so long to get here?
I think it's been a matter of who's been invited to the table and who's been able to share in these conversations. Because looking back at, Philadelphia history alone, and Chris was saying New York history, there's a rich tableau of people writing about this, of being upset about this, and of demanding change. I think it's like many other systems in our society that have existed to only lift up certain voices, usually white and male and upper class. And this is just an example of challenging these as established norms. I think the reaction with like the petition and people being upset that they could not see, these remains in this museum anymore or online, even the idea of that happening, I think that speaks to an entitlement that's sort of ingrained in these institutions as well. Yeah.
Wow. Well, if you want to, if there's a petition out there that's, supporting how the Mutter used to run. And is there anything that you all are seeing in terms of pushback from the people who are like, wait a minute, the reason why we're doing this is because it's about the dignity of the people whose remains we're talking about. Are you seeing anything kind of to counteract the narrative?
Yeah, I think so. There's been quite a bit of online chatter. That's how Chris and I connected through a bunch of people just raising concerns over this petition and about what's missing in the petition. The petition doesn't have a single mention of ethics or returning remains or anything of that nature. It's an ethical moral issue that's being framed as internal politics and denying certain public accessibility. Aside from the online dialogue and conversations that Chris can speak to a bit more, I just want to add to there's finding ceremony, which is starting in Philadelphia.
I think they're having some sort of speech at the parade, either the parade or the Monday event that I heard mentioned at the beginning here.
Oh, they're speaking at Juneteenth actually, which is tonight.
There's a Juneteenth event tonight that they're speaking at on Saturday. Okay.
Malcolm X. I think they're on around at 4:30. So sadly, by the time this recording's out, it'll be past. But everyone can check out their website. But they're offering a really interesting initiative for descendant-led repatriation and conversation about these collections. And while their focus is primarily on Black Philadelphians in the Morton Crania collection, it's part of a global conversation. Yeah, Chris, did you have anything to add about especially the online conversations and things?
Well, I haven't seen any, shall we say, petitions from this perspective, but I think that's because we don't want to center ourselves. We don't want to say, we're right and you should listen to us. We're saying, listen to the descendant communities, listen to the people who are affected by this and who are impacted by the perpetuated racisms and ableisms that are coming from this collection. And they're saying, check out these scholars, check out these individuals who are in community with the descendants of the deceased. And so I think it's really just a matter of sitting down and finding news articles or other scholars online. Social media is great for that these days, of not just watching funny cat videos, which is also fun, but looking up scholars online, looking up local community efforts to really understand the thoughts and feelings of the people who want to move forward with this.
Outcome of this is that now there's people around the world that are now following this and can help hold the Mutter accountable, because while they are conducting a review, it should at best be transparent, and as I think we both said, it should be centering descendant communities as well. So hopefully not scrutiny necessarily, but hopefully with more eyes on the situation, those that are passionate about rectifying some of these injustices can hold them accountable.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much for joining us. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, my co-host, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
Great, thanks, Denise. And before we let you go, you both have very interesting research, lines of research that I think you're doing, and it piqued my interest. So let's start with Margaret. Can you tell us where people can find more information about things that you're working on and that you're interested in?
Of course. My thesis is online. It's in their footsteps.co.co. You can also find more information about Finding Ceremony at findingceremony.com. Yes, I think those are the two biggest plugs I could make. But most importantly, on Finding Ceremony, you can sign up for updates about that movement. And there are links to social as well for people to follow.
And Chris, same question. Where can we find, more information about your interests?
Sure. I do have my own website. It's recordsofthedead.com. It's where I've put a little bit of my research out there in terms of grad school and post-grad school, and some of my writing is linked there. But really, it's not about me or my website or gaining clicks there. It's if you want to use me as a launching point to find other scholars, that would be the most ideal situation here. And those individuals who are in connection with the descendant community. I think that would be wonderful. That would be perfect.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Larry.
All right. We would like to thank Chris Bendel and Marco Sanford for joining us on the program. So Denise, we have a big day in City Council tomorrow.
Mhm.
Last session of the spring. They'll
Yes.
meet again, I believe, on September 14th, as when City Council comes back. As we heard from Councilmember Squillo, they are not on vacation all summer. They are in the office. They just aren't having meetings. But so tomorrow we're going to pass the budget. What do you think about this spring council session, where we are as a city, and what the transition might be like in the fall and then the following winter?
Well, first of all, if you're paying attention to tomorrow's council session, if you're sitting at home watching it or you're listening to it on the radio or whatever, my suggestion to you would be to pack a lunch, because you're going to be there a while. This is council has two sessions that I refer to as the cramming. I knew I had a 25-page paper due, and I'm going to try to do it in 3 days session, where there's all this legislation that folks have known needed to be passed, and they pass it all in one shot tomorrow. Now, what's going to be interesting is there is still all this money that hasn't been spent from the American Rescue Plan. And I think that on some level, council is trying to leave it for the next mayor, who many of them believe will be Sherelle Parker. And on that one hand, that's nice. But on the other hand, that means that there's a lot of stuff that could have been, taken care of in terms of, adding more money to programs, creating new programs, doing that kind of thing that wasn't done. So it's going to be interesting to see what the consequences are. And I hate to use that word, but that's the only word I could come up with. What the repercussions and consequences are going to be when the fall session starts in September, and how much of that money is going to still be left come November. Because it feels like this entire council session has been so primary focused and now so general election focused that a lot of things that could have been done or could have at least been discussed wound up not being either.
Yeah, and it's just there's only so many hours in a day,
Mhm.
and if you're campaigning, and let's say you're in a district race and you have a competitive race, a couple of the members did, or if you're running at large, I don't know how you get anything else done because you have to campaign constantly. That was a 27-person field by the time we got to election day, and if you're an incumbent, you can't take that for granted. You can't take that incumbency and say, well, I'm already in there, it's going to be fine. You have to really campaign for it. So I think it puts a lot of things on the back burner legislatively because you're just running for survival at that point. But Yeah, and when we look at the budget, which is going to be passed tomorrow, $6.3 billion budget, largest in city history. Every budget, I think, from here on out will probably be the largest in city history because that's just where we are. What I come back to is something that you mentioned. What about that American Recovery Plan? Where are we going with that? And I still don't think we've seen enough of that spent. And when we're talking about, poverty, violence, all those things, I think putting extra money into the buckets that deal with that makes a lot of sense. The administration will tell you they're concerned about deficits in later years. Fine, I can understand that. But I don't know that you hold back when there's so many issues right now that need attention, and that, some things are going to get attention, but it never really seems like enough.
And let's be honest here. While you're talking about deficits and things like that, and those things are important because unlike the federal government, the city budgets and municipal, like state budgets and city budgets, have to be balanced. You can't go around with, you can't, engage in deficit spending in municipalities and state budgets. But by the same token, it goes back to something that, you will occasionally hear from folks on the corner when they're shooting dice. Scared money don't make none. And that's kind of where we are right now. Folks are so afraid of deficit spending or the possibility of there being a deficit that they're not rolling the dice. And in the cases where they have rolled the dice, it hasn't necessarily been the most successful. Like, you have to, explain to people what's going to happen, to all of those organizations that ended up having to give back city anti-violence money because they either didn't know how to spend it, didn't spend it correctly, or were organizations that probably shouldn't have gotten it in the first place because they weren't fully formed. And you can't use deficit spending as an excuse to not address the problem that these people were given money for. I mean, let's keep it real. If the city had fulfilled its promise to make sure that somebody was there to help these organizations, many of whom were being run by people out of their own pockets, if the oversight and assistance that was promised to these organizations had actually come to fruition, we wouldn't be here. But it's going to be interesting to see just how much of this money gets held onto, and whether or not we end up having to give it back ourselves to the federal government, because there's a time limit on it, and you have to have spent that money by that time.
Yeah, the money has to be accounted for by the end of 2024 and spent down, I believe, by 2026.
Mhm.
And so that really doesn't leave a lot of time, though. If the money is not directed to where it's going by the end of this year, then that's a problem. It's a big
Mhm.
problem. And that's what I'm hoping they have figured out. Now, we spoke to Councilmember Squilla about a couple of things, and one of them is, I think, one of the talks of City Hall, who the next city council president's going to be.
Mhm.
And, we know that there are at least 3 people interested who have publicly said they're interested. Councilmember Squilla, Councilmember Johnson, and Councilmember Jones. And all 3 have different styles. All 3 have different backgrounds and different priorities as council members. But there's a long, long way to go for this.
Mhm.
What are, in your opinion, some of the signs that people should be looking for to see which direction the council might go?
I think it's kind of too early to say. And I say that because so much of council is going to be new.
Yeah.
Because of everybody who resigned to run for mayor, there's going to be a whole lot of new people on council. And while it's easy to figure out what the people who will probably be back are thinking, those aren't the only people that these three men are going to have to campaign for. They're going to have to campaign for people who are, who may or may not want them there, or may or may not agree with them. And because we still have this little like buzz in the back about minority parties here in city council. Brian O'Neill will probably win re-election to his seat, unless the Democratic candidate, can make some inroads there. But the Republicans in particular right now are looking at the possibility of Brian O'Neill being the only Republican in city council because of the Working Families Party. Nicholas O'Rourke, who ran for council with the Working Families Party when Kendra Brooks won, barely lost. He didn't lose by a lot. And it's going to be interesting to see how much effort the Republicans put in that race to either get both council at large seats for the minority party back, or to be able to hold on to at least one. But it's going to Squilla, Jones, and Johnson all have different ways of doing things, and it's going to be interesting to see how the newer people in particular are going to feel about whether or not, about which one is best.
And we only have a couple minutes left, but what makes a good council president?
Well, Darrell Clark was so good at providing consensus in council that we didn't know that some of these council members really didn't like each other until they decided to run for mayor. Then the knives came out. And that kind of made me think, wow, I wonder what caucus meetings were like for him. How much effort did he have to put in to herd these cats into in such a way that he could get legislation passed? Whoever the next council president is going to be, they're going to have that ability to make it so people will, at least consider each other's opinions and, react that way legislatively. And I don't know who among the three people that have expressed an interest is going to be the best at that. In fact, what I'm hearing is that it's probably, depending on how the new people vote, because we don't know how they're going to vote yet. If you talk to the current members of council, there's a divide between Jones supporters and Johnson supporters, and depending on how the new people feel, Squilla may end up being the compromise candidate. But what kind of disappoints me with this is that there are no women being mentioned as possibilities for city council president. And easily one of the most effective city council presidents that Philadelphia had was a woman, Anna Verna. And the fact that, no one is talking up the possibility of a Catherine Gilmore Richardson or a Cindy Bass or a Ketsi Lozada or anybody who is a woman, actually, a Jamie Gaudier, the fact that no one is talking these people up as possible city council presidents, kind of tells us that maybe we need to rethink some things.
All right. Now, Denise, we only have about a minute left. What can we expect this week for your column?
There's so much going on right now. And I think that what I may end up focusing on is this last session of council. And, how much legislation gets passed, or more importantly, why is it that every year we've got to go through a session like this?
Yeah, that's right. We're going to be there for a while tomorrow. So Denise, thank you so much. We'd like to thank our guests for being with us, and we'll be back next week on Hallmark.